This is The Quiet End, and tonight I'll tell you a story titled The Melancholy of Mirrors. Let's begin. The news arrived not with a letter but a phone call, crackling with static as though it had traveled through some impossible distance. Jonathan Wells listened with mounting confusion as a solicitor informed him of his unexpected inheritance, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Blackwood Hollow. The caller described it as eccentric, though the word was strained and colorless, as if it hid deeper, unspeakable truths. Jonathan barely remembered his Uncle Lewis. The man had been a distant, brooding figure from his childhood, a name whispered at family gatherings but rarely attached to any warmth or affection. His passing stirred no grief in Jonathan, who was far too consumed by his own. It had been 3 brittle months since the accident, barely enough time to heal, let alone welcome such unsettling news. The mansion when he arrived was a monument to disrepair. Twisting vines and cracking stones suggested it hadn't been cherished in decades. The air seemed thick, heavy, as though the structure exhaled its own weary sigh. Inside, the scent of mildew and ancient dust gnawed at his lungs. Yet what unnerved him most wasn't the decay, but the mirrors. They were everywhere. Polished silver frames, Baroque carvings of writhing figures, even angular modern ones that felt alien amidst the mansion's Victorian gloom. He first thought it eccentricity, an old man's peculiar obsession. Yet as he stepped past the half-light filtering through grime-slick windows, a chilling detail crystallized. His reflection didn't quite match. There it was, his face, drawn and pale as expected, but slower, its movements faintly delayed. And when he stilled his breathing, his mirrored self smiled. It was faint, wrong, yet undeniable. His own mouth remained grim and tight, but his image on the glass ever so slightly smirked. Exhaustion, he whispered to the empty hall, barely convincing himself. Just exhaustion. But as his eyes darted to the many mirrors scattered around, the oppressive weight of being watched pressed upon him. Something, somewhere, lingered behind the silvered glass. The air was still, stagnant, and cloaked in an oppressive midnight silence. Jonathan couldn't sleep. The weight of the mirrors, their strange presence in every room, pressed against his mind. He told himself it was grief, or the maddening isolation of this crumbling mansion, but somehow it felt closer to dread. Driven by restless curiosity, he found himself standing before the largest of the mirrors in the grand hall, its gilded frame curling upward like frozen tongues of flame. The faint light from his lantern traced the contours of his reflection, pale and gaunt amid the dark. Then he heard it, a whisper. Soft, fleeting, and nearly imperceptible, it drifted from the glass as if the reflection itself had drawn breath to utter his name. "Jonathan," it called, in a voice that was both alien and hauntingly familiar. His pulse quickened. He fought the urge to turn away, but found his body betraying him, his gaze locked onto the surface. The whispering grew, faint echoes surfacing from other mirrors around the hall, layering one atop the next, like discordant notes swelling into a chorus. "Look closer," they urged. Against his better judgment, his trembling hands brought the lantern nearer. His mirrored self leaned forward, but it wasn't him. The movements were wrong, deliberate, and warped. In the mirror, Jonathan's reflection smashed a vase onto the floor in a violent rage. A room he hadn't seen before, a moment he hadn't lived. He stumbled back, but his foot scraped against the edge of another smaller mirror. His reflection appeared there too, silent, unmoving, except for its face. His lips twisted upward into a grotesque grin far too wide for his own features, eyes hollow and gleaming with malice. Panic gripped his chest as the whispers crescendoed, overlapping till they were drowning him. "Jonathan! Closer! Jonathan!" He backed away, shaking, as the walls seemed to pulse with wailing voices. The lantern flickered violently as his breathing grew rapid. He turned from the mirrors, but their fractured whispers followed him, a promise of something lurking behind the glass. Jonathan discovered the journals in an old wooden chest tucked away in the study, alongside faded photographs bound with twine. The room smelled of rotting paper and the faint, metallic tang of something he couldn't identify, an unsettling undertone to this already unnerving night. The handwriting within the leather-bound journals was jagged, frantic. The first entries were mundane, cataloging the mansion's history and its peculiar collection of mirrors. But as he flipped through, the entries spiraled into fevered ramblings that made Jonathan's pulse quicken with unease. "They do not show reflections," one entry read in spidery scrawl, "but possibilities, each surface a doorway to what we hide within. Shards of truth, fragments of the self. Beware what they reveal." Further entries spoke of Uncle Lewis's deteriorating mental state. He'd become obsessed with the mirrors, convinced they were windows to alternate versions of oneself, distorted by fear, desire, and madness. The more he stared, the more vivid and autonomous his reflections became. According to the journals, where they differed was never arbitrary. It was always deliberate. One phrase was repeated across several pages, scrawled hastily and underlined in an almost desperate repetition: "Do not stare too long. The boundary blurs, and once it is broken, it cannot be mended." Jonathan glanced at the photographs. Many were of the mansion, its mirrors prominently displayed. But there were others, snapshots of Uncle Louis himself. A man gaunt with time, his eyes sunken and hollow, his reflection in the background subtly wrong. In one photo, while Louis appeared to be posing stiffly, his mirrored image reached for something unseen. The oppressive weight of anxiety clawed its way up Jonathan's spine. He wanted nothing more than to burn the journals, to smash every mirror in the house, yet he felt a deep, unshakable compulsion to keep looking. The mirrors were like unanswered questions, pulling him closer with their sinister, silent invitations. And so he found himself, hours later, wandering down the dim corridors with no conscious memory of choosing to move. The mirrors, their surfaces shimmering faintly, seemed to breathe with him, their distorted truths waiting to be seen. Jonathan's sense of reality began to fray. The shift was subtle at first, a hesitation in his reflection's movements, a brief delay in its reactions. But soon the discrepancies became undeniable. He reached for the handle of a door in the east hallway. The cool brass turned easily in his palm, yet when his eyes darted to the mirror across the hall, his reflection stood unmoving, its hand hanging limp at its side. He let out a nervous laugh, an almost involuntary attempt to dispel the unease, but the reflection, it screamed. No sound reached him, yet the contorted face in the glass bellowed silently, its mouth stretching too wide, as though dislocating its jaw. He slammed the door shut and stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gulps. What weighed on him most wasn't the reflection's defiance, but the creeping feeling that he was losing himself. Several times he caught fleeting glimpses of moments his mind couldn't reconcile. Had he already walked down this corridor tonight, or was that his reflection taking liberties? Had he truly knocked over the lantern last night, or was it something else, something not real? The questions carved ruts in his sanity. More than once he woke screaming, sweat-soaked and trembling, from dreams of suffocation, trapped beneath cold, unyielding glass as countless versions of himself watched with malign indifference. Desperate to reclaim control, he attempted to cover the mirrors. Dusty sheets he found tucked away in forgotten wardrobes served as shrouds, each one hurriedly draped over the glass. For a moment, just a moment, this small act gave him solace, but the relief was short-lived. As he stood in the candlelit gloom of the study, he realized the sheets were rippling faintly. The shadows beneath moved, shifting languidly as though something waited, coiled, and breathing just beyond the fabric. A whisper emerged from one covered mirror, low and insidious. "You can't hide us." Jonathan stepped back, heart hammering, as another sheet fluttered faintly, its shadow indistinct and malicious. The mirrors weren't simply objects, they were agents of something darker. He wasn't just staring at them. They were staring back, and they were waiting. It began with a prickling sensation, the unmistakable feeling of being watched, sharp as pins along Jonathan's spine. But the room was still, cloaked in flickering shadow and suffocating silence. It wasn't until he glanced toward the uncovered mirror in the far corner of the dining room that he saw it. The reflection was standing there, perfectly still. Jonathan froze. He hadn't moved, but his reflection, it watched him. The longer he stared, the more wrong it became. It mirrored his face, his shape, but not his stillness. Its head was tilted ever so slightly to the side, its dark eyes unblinking, as though waiting for something unspoken. He turned sharply away, heart hammering, yet the feeling did not dissipate. As he moved from room to room, the presence clung to him, suffocating and inescapable. The reflection began appearing where it shouldn't. Mirrors he hadn't passed yet displayed glimpses of him within their frames. In one hallway, he dared to peek into an oval mirror beside the stairwell and nearly dropped his lantern. It was already there, waiting for him, its gaze sharp and knowing, and worse, its lips were moving. His voice, his own voice, slithered through the air like something venomous. "You thought you could leave it all behind," it said, the tone tinged with a deep, biting mockery. "Tell yourself new lies, forget the parts of you you despise." Jonathan stumbled backward, gripping the banister for support. What are you?" he whispered, the words trembling as they left him. In the glass, the reflection tilted its head further, its expression twisted into something grotesquely familiar, his face but saturated with malice. "I am what you hid," it hissed. "The truer Jonathan, what you were too much of a coward to be. You've let their lies rot you into something hollow. But don't worry." The reflection leaned closer, yet its frame wavered as though the glass could no longer hold it. "I'll take over soon, I'll fix everything you poisoned." Jonathan recoiled. The lantern in his hand flickered dangerously, casting the room into wild, frantic shadows. He didn't remember running, but he found himself slamming the door to his bedroom shut, pressing his back against it as his breaths came in panicked bursts. From somewhere deep in the halls, faint whispers reached his ears, harmonizing with his thundering heartbeat. The reflection wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting for its moment to emerge. Jonathan ran, each frantic step echoing through the mansion's decaying halls. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay. The air was thick and suffocating, as though the house itself were closing in around him, folding and warping like a living thing. He threw open a door to what should have been the front foyer. Instead, he found himself stumbling into a parlor, its walls lined with mirrors. His breath hitched as he saw them, his reflections, dozens of them, watching him from within their silvered prisons. But they weren't just watching. They moved independently now, mimicking some gestures, while others pointed at him, their expressions smug and taunting. One tilted its head back in exaggerated laughter, though no sound came through. He turned away, grabbing for the next door, but it led to another room. More mirrors, more reflections. Panic clawed at him as he slammed the door behind him and tried the window instead. The glass wouldn't budge, and when his palm struck it, ripples spread across its surface as if it were water. Through it, his reflection smiled. Jonathan stumbled back, chest heaving. That's when he noticed the nearest mirror. One of the figures was missing. His reflection was gone. Before he could process the thought, hands gripped his shoulders from behind, cold, firm, and real. His entire body froze as a voice, his own, but soaked in venom, spoke softly just inches from his ear. "You can't run, Jonathan. You belong here." He spun around, his pulse pounding like thunder, and there it was, his alternate self, standing inches away. Its grin was wide and sharp, stretching too far, its posture unnervingly relaxed. But those eyes, they gleamed with malevolent delight, radiating a cruel understanding of something Jonathan couldn't grasp. The room began to warp, twisting in on itself. The walls shimmered like liquid, and the boundaries between mirrors and reality dissolved. Each surface seemed to bleed into the next, endless reflections upon reflections, creating an infinite disorienting maze. He tried to look away, to focus on anything solid, but the figure stepped closer, its movements too fluid, too alien. "You gave up your place long ago," the alternate hissed, its voice now layered with a chorus of whispers. "This house isn't crumbling, you are." Jonathan could no longer tell if the mirrors surrounded him or if he had become trapped within one. Reaching out blindly, his hands met cold, slick glass. The reflection before him raised its arms too, but it no longer felt like mimicry. It felt like control. Jonathan sat in the center of the room, unable to move, surrounded by mirrors that stretched to the edges of infinity. Each pane held 1,000 versions of himself, twisted and consumed by madness. Their faces were caricatures of his own, smirking, crying, snarling, and laughing with a deranged glee that made his stomach turn. The reflections shouted at him, their voices weaving together into one deafening chorus. "You gave up. You let it consume you. You belong here now, broken, shattered, forgotten." Jonathan covered his ears. though it did nothing to stop their words. His own face stared back at him from every direction, warped and insidious. Then the first crack split through the silence. One mirror fractured, a jagged line snaking across its surface. Jonathan felt it deep within himself, a sharp, searing loss, as though something vital had been torn away. Another crack erupted, and then another, each one ripping through the universe of glass shards. He clawed at the ground, gasping, as pieces of himself began to slip away. A thought, a memory, a flicker of identity, gone forever. He was being dismantled piece by piece. The mirrors splintered into chaos, eruptions of shimmering debris cascading to the floor. With each shard that fell, Jonathan's screams became laughter, echoing laughter, high and unnatural, threading through the spaces where no walls remained. The room itself dissolved into nothingness, eroded by the fractures of reality. When the last shard struck the ground, silence reigned. The mansion was gone. The plot of land where it once stood was empty now, open to the wind and sky. But the reflection remained. Passers-by would whisper of strange phenomena, shimmering visions in the air above the earth, faint outlines of mirrors that shouldn't exist. Some claimed they saw their own faces in the distortions, wickedly twisted, staring back at them with an unnatural grin. And as night fell, if one dared to linger, they might hear the laughter. Jonathan's laughter, stretching across the distance, faint but unmistakable, until it was impossible to tell if it was outside or within. He was still watching. So tell me, dear listener, when you next catch your reflection lingering a little too long, will you dare to look away? Subscribe for more chilling tales and hit the bell to stay in the dark. See you at the next quiet end.